James Connolly. As many of you probably know this history, but James Connolly came to the United States in 1902 and moved to Troy in 1903, setting up house at 96 Ingalls Avenue, a few blocks from where this forum takes place. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused the firm to falter. And while here, he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in a notable dispute with its leader, Daniel De Leon, over the utility of fighting for wage increases. He was for this, and other questions. As most of you know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in great labor conflicts like the Dublin Lockout of 1913 and led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against British rule in 1916. He was executed by the British as a result, and today he is recognized as one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century. So this evening, as you know, we have Sarah Jaffe with us. She's a Nation Institute Fellow and an independent journalist covering labor, economic justice, social movements, politics, gender, and pop culture. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Salon, The Week, The American Prospect, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and many other publications. She's also the co-host with Michelle Chen of Dissent magazine's Belabored podcast, as well as an editorial board member at Dissent and a columnist at New Labor Forum. Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt is her first book. Jaffe was one of the first reporters to cover Occupy Wall Street and the Fight for 15. She's appeared on numerous radio and television programs to discuss topics ranging from electoral politics to Superstorm Sandy, and from punk rock to public sector unions. She has a master's degree in journalism from Temple University in Philadelphia and a bachelor's degree in English from Loyola University in New Orleans. She was born and raised in Massachusetts, has lived in South Carolina, Louisiana, Colorado, and Pennsylvania, but currently calls New York home. As we'll hear more about in just a minute, Necessary Trouble is the definitive book on the movements that are poised to permanently remake American politics. We are witnessing a moment of unprecedented political turmoil and social activism. Over the last few years, we've seen the growth of the Tea Party, a 21st century black freedom struggle with Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, and the grassroots network supporting presidential candidates in defiance of the traditional party elites. In Necessary Trouble, Sarah Jaffe leads readers into the heart of these movements, explaining what has made ordinary Americans become activists. As Jaffe argues, the financial crisis in 2008 was the spark, the moment that crystallized that something was wrong. For years, she crisscrossed the country asking people what they were angry about and what they were doing to take power back. She attended a people's assembly in a church gymnasium in Ferguson, Missouri, walked a picket line at an Atlanta Burger King, rode a bus from New York to Ohio with student organizers, some of whom are here, and went door to door in Queens days after Hurricane Sandy. From the successful fight for a $15 minimum wage in Seattle and New York, to the halting of Shell's Arctic drilling program, Americans are discovering the effectiveness of making good, necessary trouble. Regardless of political alignment, they are boldly challenging who wields power in this country. And these books are available for sale. Please don't hesitate to pick up a copy, and I'm sure Sarah will sign a copy for you. But without further ado, we're so glad to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. Emily didn't mention that she's also in my book. So I'm really pleased to be here for a lot of reasons. One is that I live in the Hudson Valley now, and so I like actually getting out to different parts of New York that isn't New York City. One is that I get to speak under a banner of James Connolly, which the first time I came up here to attend a James Connolly forum, I was like, I want to speak under a giant banner of James Connolly. This is great. I love James Connolly. And the thing that Emily mentioned about the battle with Daniel De Leon is particularly interesting because it was about wage increases, right? And Daniel De Leon was of the opinion that all we needed to do was fight for the revolution, and like making people's lives better in the here and now didn't really matter. And you know, James Connolly was both for making people's lives better in the here and now, and also actually went and tried to start a revolution and got executed for it. So that ability that he had and that argument that he always made for, you know, fight for what you can win immediately, but also always keep your eye on the long-term struggle and for the opportunity that you might have to advance it, is meaningful to me as somebody who covers sort of day-to-day labor battles, things like the UAW lockout in here in Green Island, and also people who are thinking about what does the next society look like, what does it look like after capitalism. And so, yeah, so James Connolly, the first time I went to Ireland was in the summer of 2001, and I've been kind of obsessed ever since. And this spring, I actually went to Ireland to cover the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, which was a very interesting experience for a lot of reasons. For those of you who don't know, the current ruling party in Ireland is the historically right-wing party, and these all go back to the Irish Civil War, basically, the two center-right parties, essentially. But the writer of the two center-right parties was in power because the slightly more, you know, the one associated with small farmers rather than big farmers, basically, had been the one that enacted austerity that was demanded after the financial meltdown, which I will talk about plenty tonight. And so the fact that this party that would have not only opposed but actively sort of tried to crush the 1916 Rising was in charge of trying to celebrate it made it a very, very interesting experience. You know, we were staying in a hotel that was just off of O'Connell Street, which is where the GPO, the post office that they held, that was the headquarters for Connolly during the Rising. You can still walk down and put your finger in the bullet holes, and if anybody's going, I have an excellent walking tour from 1916 to recommend to you. But yeah, we got there, and I dragged my partner into the GPO because he'd never been to Ireland on the first day, and it was a good thing I did because after that it was all fenced off for the next however long. And there were giant viewing stands built for people who were guests of state, heads of state. You know, the English ambassador, very important person to have at your celebration of the attempt to win independence from England. Very important to make sure that the English ambassador has an honored seat. Other people included blood relatives of people who fought in 1916, which is a you know, reasonable thing, except when you think about the fact that this was an attempt to win Ireland for all the people of Ireland and not just those who were descended from specific people who had the right bloodline. You think about these things being slightly problematic. And so the morning of the actual commemoration on Easter Sunday, which was also not on the correct date because it was Easter, you know, Easter changes year by year. But anyway, I'm a stickler for history. Also, it happened over my birthday, so I really wanted it to be over my birthday. But on that official day, we kind of stayed in bed in the hotel because there was no way we were going to see it anyway, and just watched it on our RTE. And first, you know, you have the president comes and lays a wreath, and they say some things, and then you have a military parade. And anybody who has thought about the history of 1916 in particular, and Ireland in general, knows that tanks rolling down the streets of Dublin has not generally ended very well for the people of Ireland. So celebrating 1916, you kind of got the vibe that, like, they were saying, now, great job that you did this back then, but don't you dare try it anything right now. So it was a very interesting experience to be there. We went to some other smaller commemorations. They went to the Sinn Féin March, went to a few parties and things that were held by groups of the left that were actually trying to reclaim the actual revolutionary character of 1916. And also went to one commemoration where there was an excellent set of protests happening by people who were also wearing period costume, which was great. We were just dressed like it was 1916, but then yelling horrible things at the I forget what her actual title is, the heritage minister, I think, who had been, up until the week before when the lawsuit was won to try to save this historic site and also this historic market, which was one of the few streets in Dublin that really has, you know, it had Middle Eastern restaurants, it had farm stands, it was a place of multiculturalism in a fairly not terribly multicultural society. Up until that week, the same person who was laying the reef at this historic place had been trying to have them level it for a shopping mall. So it was an interesting trip to Ireland. And so there had been an election right before we went there, and there was actually no government at the time we were there, because the left had not really coalesced behind any one party of the left, but there was enough of a movement, and that movement had come, Ireland took a lot of austerity, and we didn't hear that much about it. We heard a lot about Greece, and we heard a lot about Spain, and that was because the people in those places rose up. And Ireland kind of took it. The government very, very specifically took it and was very interested in being the good austerity victim, basically. If they behaved, then the abuse would stop, and they did actually get more favorable terms than Greece or Spain after that. But there's only so much that they could take, and the thing that really set off the resistance in Ireland was water charges. Because, if you've been to Ireland, it rains a lot. It's, as somebody said to me, this is like the wettest country in the world, and you want to raise what we pay for water. And so that really set off a movement around the country, people resisting these water charges. And people would take out the water meters, just refuse to pay, and this became a huge issue in the election. The labor movement got involved, and they built up the right to water movement into something called Right to Change that was at least somewhat effective in this election. So I can talk about Ireland forever, but I did write this book that was not about Ireland. But I would just I've been thinking about water because I just got back from North Dakota, and yesterday, and I went to North Dakota to cover the pipeline blockade that's going on by the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And this is the Dakota Access Pipeline, which would go through, go under the Missouri River, and we all know what happens to pipelines. In fact, one that is, no joke, the Colonial Pipeline in, I think, West Virginia just ruptured yesterday. And the fact that that is the Colonial Pipeline, and we're talking about water, all of this fits in very nicely because what's going on at Standing Rock is, it's a movement. I would put it in, it would be in this book if this book was coming out 6 months later. I would put it in the context of the other struggles that are going on right now because it is a struggle for water, but it is also a struggle for land. It is also a struggle for racial justice, for economic justice, for the word that everybody kept saying to me, right, was this is a space where we are learning to decolonize ourselves. And it's an incredible place to be for a couple of days and just look at the camp. It's huge. There's a couple thousand people there this week. And that was after the decision to ask the company nicely to temporarily halt construction in this particular area. And to see all of these different people, and people riding horses, they have a school set up for the kids, there are flags from every native nation that had come there. There was a delegation from Ecuador while I was there. And people kept saying, we're holding this space because of the pipeline, but we're also holding this space and coming together as a people and thinking about how we can decolonize this space and decolonize ourselves. And, I'm thinking about Ireland, I'm thinking about water, thinking about all of these things, and I'm thinking about fighting struggles against colonialism and thinking about that as an important part of struggling for equality, which was something that James Connolly very much understood and argued for and probably fought with Daniel De Leon over. Because let's be really, fought with Daniel De Leon over just about everything. And so, it always brings me back to talking about capitalism. And I've brought several people back at Standing Rock to talking about capitalism too. And I think about all of this stuff when I'm talking about what's going on in Ireland right now, everything. And I date this back, and I date this back in the book, to the 2008 financial crisis. And this was a moment that we you know, the prevailing ideology of there is no alternative, that this is the only way that things can possibly be, this is not only the best, but literally the only way that things can be. British writer Mark Fisher calls it capitalist realism, based on the Frederick Jameson line that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. I'll return to the end of the world in a little bit, but the end of capitalism, however, I like to envision. And, you know, but it was hard to do that. It's still kind of hard to do it, but it got a lot easier after capitalism basically tried to commit suicide in 2008, where, you know, you have this crisis and you're watching, you know, Hank Paulson and his buddies in the Bush administration go from like, oh, this is just a little thing, it'll be fine, to like, oh my God, give us $700 billion right now or else, you know, the world's going to explode. And I think that what happened in that moment, I mean, what happened first was shock, right? And I am not going to recite a Naomi Klein's shock doctrine argument to anybody because you've all probably read it. But what also happened was that we had to picture the end of capitalism. And we had to actually think about what that might mean and what then we could imagine that might come next. And so, you know, from that moment to this year when 12 million and some odd Americans voted for a, you know, guy with a Brooklyn accent who calls himself a socialist, which was a thing that was pretty unthinkable to, well, me, as of this time last year, a lot of other people, certainly Bernie Sanders himself. We've seen a lot of changes, and I think, you know, I wrote a book about social movements, and I wrote a book about all of them rather than one of them, because, or not all of them, I mean, there are limits to what I can fit in a 300-page book, but I wanted to actually put these things into context of each other, not just to say, like, this is Occupy Wall Street over here, and this is Moral Mondays over here, and this is Black Lives Matter over here, but that these are actually things that are all happening in this particular historical moment. And they're not only like literally connected, because like I'm looking at people in this room who are in multiple of those movements at once, but that they are connected because of the issues that we're struggling with and the particular historical circumstances that have made it easier to picture something else and to picture actually making not just little changes and not just like who we elect in November, but like what does the next system look like? What does the world look like without white supremacy? What does the world look like with, what does equality look like? What does freedom look like? And, you know, I'm here, tomorrow is the 5th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and I've been getting a lot of emails this week. A lot of emails. A lot of people have a lot of questions about what happened to Occupy. I was in Atlanta like a week and a half ago. God, I need to stay home more. And people kept asking me there, particularly, about Occupy. What happened to Occupy? And where did those people go? And what did it achieve? And are those people ever going to like get serious and run for office? And some of them, yes. I guess one guy just won office somewhere in Massachusetts. I have not really followed the story because I was busy not having internet in North Dakota. But, you know, I think now I can look around and one of my editors asked me to give a list of sort of concrete accomplishments that have happened since Occupy. And it was not a hard list to come up with. It took me about 5 minutes to come up with. Probably slightly easier because this is what I do all day long. But to think about like where this led us. But I don't actually start with Occupy. I actually start the book with well, I actually start the book with a guy who had joined the Tea Party. And he was on, I used to work for Laura Flanders on a little show called Grit TV that used to be on 5 days a week. And this was early 2010, and we had this guy on named J.D. Meadows, who was complaining about the Benchcraft plant in his town closed down, and they moved it to China, and everybody lost their jobs. And the banks got bailed out, but his small business was struggling because nobody in town, he was a computer repairman, and no one in town could afford to get their computer repaired because they don't have jobs because the Benchcraft plant went to China. And I'm listening to this guy and going, he's mad about the same things I'm mad about. And he joined not only the Tea Party, but the Council of Conservative Citizens, which got a little famous a couple years later after a guy named Dylan Roof apparently started reading their website and then decided to go shoot 9 black people in a church in South Carolina. So the Council of Conservative Citizens is a white supremacist organization. It has been one since its inception. It is still one. And it was really thrilled to have the Tea Party to latch onto. I'm sure it's really thrilled to have Donald Trump to latch onto right now. They've been keeping low profile since Dylan Roof, but nonetheless. And so, you know, this guy's from Ripley, Mississippi, and there's no James Connolly for him in Ripley, Mississippi. Maybe you should export.
We'd love to.
Right? Exactly. And so, you know, I'm listening to him talk, and I'm thinking, like, what would it take to get this guy on our side? What would it take to actually convince this guy that the people who are screwing him over are not immigrants, they're billionaires? And so, you know, I kept thinking of him. I thought about him when I was walking around Occupy Wall Street and looking at these cardboard signs that everybody had written and going, like, every single grievance that I heard that guy say would have fit in just fine on a sign at Occupy. And yeah, I tried to find him. I couldn't actually track him down because I really wanted to interview him for the book. I really wanted to know, like, what he thought of all these things that happened afterwards. And he's probably voting for Trump. And I did not succeed in making that strategic intervention. But you know, I think that, I hope anyway, that there have been opportunities since then for that guy to change his mind. But you know, the Tea Party was everything at that point in time, right? It was on the media 24/7. It was constant. Fox News, and then because Fox News, everybody else, every other news outlet followed Fox News because that's a great way to report journalism. And what happens normally when there's a protest movement, I mean, most of you all know, right? The media like looks at it once and goes, why don't those people realize that they have to just go home and vote for a Democrat or a Republican, I guess. And that's it. And so for Fox News, and because of Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC, and everybody else to cover all these Tea Party protests and talk about them, they were like reasonable people who had a reasonable grievance and like had reason to be as angry as they were, was weird, right? It was not normal, and it made protest look more legitimate. And of course the Tea Party also was stealing all its ideas from the left. They were reading Saul Alinsky and thinking about how to disrupt things. And yeah, but that kind of had a hold on everything up until February of 2011 when a bunch of graduate students, here's to graduate student unionism, decided to stay in the Wisconsin State Capitol when the governor wanted to take away collective bargaining rights. And grad students did it, and then pretty much everyone else did it. It's a good lesson for life. Not really. But, and I remember, you know, I wanted to be a labor journalist. I finished grad school right after the financial crisis in 2009. And I thought, I'm going to learn all about this. Like, I'm going to learn what a credit default swap is. I'm going to learn what just nuked the economy because, like, everybody's saying that this stuff is just impossible to understand. It's not that hard to understand. A credit default swap is a bet. So Wisconsin, you know, it changed the story. And it was about collective bargaining rights for public sector workers, which, like, is not a thing that anybody, even public sector workers, even public sector union leaders, thought was going to get anybody riled up enough to camp out in a state capitol for however many weeks it ended up being, 6. But it did. And it did because it was also about something bigger than that, right? It was about austerity. It was about the financial crisis. It was about this moment when teachers and social workers were being told that they were the ones who were going to have to suffer because a bunch of jerks who worked on Wall Street had crashed capitalism. And so, you know, that was the first moment that, I mean, it was the first moment somebody wanted me to write an article about labor and pay me for it. And I didn't have to, like, twist arms and beg. I am here because people, I mean, literally because I wouldn't have had anything to write a book about, but also because I probably would be on the campaign trail somewhere covering Donald Trump or something awful. And yeah, so, you know, I think that Occupy is an important story to tell, but it's certainly not the only story to tell, and it gets told, I mean, all these movements get told as if, the stories get told as if they all happened in a vacuum, right? So Wisconsin happened over here, and then that ended, and it failed because Scott Walker is still governor. Unfortunately, Scott Walker is still governor. But so that failed. And then Occupy happened over here, and that failed because they were kicked out of camps by a lot of cops, although I'm here in Albany, and the police here kind of resisted that for a little while, right? I mean, that was a slightly interesting story. Because, you know, everybody hates Andrew Cuomo, including apparently the people who are supposed to protect him. Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo gives me a great example, though, because people, you know, again, when I'm being asked this question of like, well, what have these movements done because they haven't elected anybody to office? And I'm like, yeah, well, you know, Andrew Cuomo was deeply opposed to anything progressive. He was opposed to millionaire's tax right up until he had to approve it. He was certainly opposed to raising the minimum wage, and opposed to allowing New York City to raise its own minimum wage, opposed to any of those things. And he resisted, and he resisted, and he resisted, up until a bunch of people went on strike. There was also that little matter of the federal investigation. But, you know, Andrew Cuomo flipped, and now he's bragging about how New York is leading the country, which is not only, like, you get no credit for it anyway, and also factually inaccurate, but, you know, Andrew Cuomo flipped, and now at least some people in New York State are going to get $15 an hour minimum wage, eventually. These things are slow. And, you know, so I think that it's election season. Everybody keeps asking me about the election. I don't want to talk about the election. I don't want to talk about any of it. But you know, we have to think about the different ways that movements wield power. And some of them are maybe electing somebody like Shama Sawant to the Seattle City Council so that you have somebody who is on your side. And sometimes it's making Andrew Cuomo change his mind and eat his words and give a press conference where he grits his teeth and says, we're going to lead the country in a $15 an hour minimum wage. Because Andrew Cuomo. And I had a lot of chapters in this book when I was writing a proposal for it. And one of them was about Trayvon Martin. It was about what we weren't yet calling Black Lives Matter. And it was the summer of 2014, and I was having a hard time convincing publishers that they wanted this book. And I was meeting with Nation Books, which did want the book, but also still wasn't sure about the structure and wasn't sure if it's okay.
Sorry about that. I thought this was on. It's Andrew Cuomo. Oh.
You know, Andrew Cuomo, man, he's listening to me. That's why he won't answer my press requests. So I was trying to convince people that, like, actually these movements are continuing to grow and things are going on and there are connections between these. And then, you know, I was trying to convince them of that. And then my second meeting with them was like August 16th, I think. And, you know, at least some people in here remember what happened on August 14th in Ferguson. And so, yeah, and I wanted to write about the militarization of the police and the militarization of sort of everything in American life while we're talking about Colin Kaepernick sitting down for the national anthem and how suddenly that is conceived of as an insult to the military, because that's a connection that we should just immediately draw, right? That the American flag is a representation of the military, because America is the military. And yeah, and then we looked at Ferguson, and you watch people who are peacefully protesting and mourning the fact that this, you know, this kid, he was young. He was left in the street for 4.5 hours. And like, I kind of always want to pause for like 4.5 minutes after that just to think about like how long that is. His neighbor, or his father's neighbor. And that was just like, okay, with the police. They thought that was fine. That, you know, this kid who was walking home with Skittles and an iced tea was a threat. He was armed with the sidewalk. I was leaving through Penn Station the other day, and there was a protest outside, and there were people standing there, and they were holding things that represented different people who had been killed. And you know, so they're all wearing hoodies, and one person is holding an iced tea and a bag of Skittles, and one person was holding CDs for Elton Sterling, and one person was holding a pack of cigarettes for Eric Garner. And I'm just looking at this, going like, I buy these at the street corner thing, and people got killed for them. They didn't get killed for them. They got killed because of racism. And so, you know, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Oscar Grant, Troy Davis. You remember Troy Davis? You know, there are so many of these stories, and it's hard. It's hard with any of these movements to say like why one thing took off when it did. But a story I tell in the book is about the folks who became the Dream Defenders, who decided they were going to march from Daytona, Florida to Sanford, and they were going to sit in outside of the Sanford Police Department, and they were going to demand that George Zimmerman finally be arrested. And he was eventually. Some like 2 million people or something had to sign a petition in order for that to happen. And then, of course, George Zimmerman was acquitted. And, you know, those same people went back and they occupied the state capitol in Florida. And, again, the story after that is that they lost and it was over until 2014. And, yeah, when you see these things, you know, movements don't go in a straight line. Revolutions don't go in a straight line. Everything goes up and down, and there are moments of calm, and there are moments of, oh my God, what the hell is going on here? Like the last couple weeks. And, yeah, but I think it was also important to put Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, since Black Lives Matter is an organization, in this context too, because we're watching people, you know, we're watching a lot of things happen at once, but one of them is thinking about what comes next. And so I keep talking about this, and I'm going to keep talking about it for the rest of my book tour, certainly. When you look at the Vision for Black Lives platform that was released on August 1st, you know, it's not just a document about ending the police, you know, ending police violence, let alone ending the police. It's about everything. And I think that's, you know, that's the part of the story that gets missed again and again, right? The one-line description in most news articles is like, Black Lives Matter, it's the movement to end police violence, and it's, you know, that's a pretty simple description, but it's not, it doesn't remotely encompass enough. And so, I don't know, I want to leave some time for people to ask questions. I know we were running a little late. But so, I did want to touch on Moral Mondays, because I have people in here that I met at Moral Mondays in Albany. And I find Moral Mondays interesting in this particular context because Moral Mondays is, it's sort of wound up being very legible to the press and to sort of liberalism, I guess, because Moral Mondays has a leader, right? There's a man that you can invite to come speak at the DNC, and there's a person who is you know, sort of fulfills everybody's image of a charismatic civil rights leader. And he is. I mean, you hear the man speak, Reverend Barber, and you're just like, you know. But it also spread. It also is not a movement that is just one person. It is a movement that I came to visit in Albany, and I talked to people who are doing Moral Mondays in Illinois, and people that I talked to who were from Moral Mondays in North Carolina went to Ferguson, and they had a Moral Mondays there. And many of you probably saw the pictures of Cornel West getting arrested, climbing the fence at Memorial Mondays in Ferguson for the 1-year anniversary of Michael Brown's death. And, you know, again, I think one of the points that I wanted to make in this book, and one of the points that I keep having to argue with people over, is that there's not one leader or even a small handful of leaders, and my industry is largely responsible for the portrayal of certain people as leaders who have not actually been chosen as leaders from within their own movement. I'm talking about journalism. Journalists are lazy. You see one person get interviewed somewhere and you're like, oh, that's the leader, and everybody calls the same person, and if that person is not very deeply committed to passing the mic, then that person becomes the leader, whether anybody actually follows them or not. So, yeah, and then, trying to keep an eye on time here. And I wound up this book where I sort of began with the climate justice movement, and particularly when I wrote the proposal, I didn't have a climate change chapter in this book. I didn't think about it, and it kind of wasn't my thing, so I had not really considered how it would fit. And then Hurricane Sandy happened, and I started to think about how it would fit because, you know, Occupy people did Occupy Sandy in New York. And then I started to, you know, realize, like, not only does this need to be in here, but it needs to be the final chapter. And sort of had fun with it because, like, even the Tea Partier that I interviewed, Debbie Dooley, founded something called the Green Tea Party because she believes in she believes in solar energy, and she believes in distributed energy. She likes to talk about fighting the Koch brothers on government subsidies for fossil fuels because the Koch brothers' libertarianism is you know, about that deep when it comes to getting our money for their business. And so, you know, I tried to loop the book around both with talking about an issue that I think is you know, if we had to imagine the end of if we had to imagine the end of capitalism, climate change makes us kind of actually imagine the end of the world, right? And then think about, okay, if that's really what we're facing, if this is this big, horrifyingly scary thing that it is, on some level, I think that's why it's easy to push aside. You know, it's really horrifying to contemplate. But it also allows you to imagine something else. So, like, when I was in North Dakota, I'm looking around at people who are imagining what the world looks like, both what the world looked like before Europeans showed up and trashed it, and what it looks like after. And so, yeah, I think that's probably, you know, I almost want to quote from this review of my book today, which is terrible, I realize. But, like, every now and then somebody writes something and I'm like, oh, you get it. About the fact that this moment is about imagining more and imagining different. And so, you know, it was hard to write a book about it while all these things are still happening, while everything is very much in motion, and, like, you know, we were constantly going like, oh my God, can I change this before we go to press? And, like, there are all these steps in when a book goes to press that, like, you can change less and less each time, so that at the end you literally have to, like, fit the amount of words on, or the amount of letters on a line, or else you're going to screw up all of your pagination. And so it was, you know, in a lot of ways I was terrified that, like, something was going to happen to totally contradict everything in the book in the time between it going to print and it landing in stores, which thankfully didn't really happen. Because everything is ongoing, and so, you know, I could be a historian, I could have waited 20 years and, you know, do the thing that, or 50 years, because all those books are about the 1960s are still coming out. But I wanted to do it now because I thought it was important to recognize people while they're still here. And to that end, because I'm standing under James Connolly, I'm actually going to quote James Connolly on it. And I was reading him on the plane back from North Dakota yesterday, and highlighted this line and showed it to my friend who was sitting next to me. And he wrote, "When her rebel sons and daughters were dead, hunted, imprisoned, hanged, or exiled, she would weep for them, pray for them, sigh for them, cry for them, and when they were long enough out of the way, erect monuments to them. But as long as they were virile, active, and aggressive, Ireland regarded them only as disturbers who gave the country a bad name. To be execrated when living and deified when dead has been the experience of all champions of freedom in all the countries and ages of the earth. So, you know, I'm standing under James Connolly. We have a monument to him that he probably fought for a long time to be able to raise. But we should also remember the people who are fighting now, this moment, taking a break from it to be here. So thank all of you for listening to me talk. So, I don't know if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Just curious, in your life, if there was any particular events that were kind of really hit close to home,
Yeah.
and you developing this kind of, I don't know, view.
You know,
in
it's
particular people or events.
Yeah.
Or
It's funny because I joke about punk rock and shitty jobs being my radicalizing events. I grew up outside of Boston, and there was a lot of political punk rock. Particularly, there was a lot of punk rock that was like very Irish and very into labor unions.
Yeah.
And this is kind of my formative years. But you know, I thought about this, and it was in my proposal, and I didn't put it in the book because the book isn't about me. But when I was a kid, my parents owned a chain of restaurants in the Boston suburbs, and they were doing really well for a little while. We had a bunch of money, and then they all kind of collapsed, and we had no money. And I feel like that, I kind of had the 2008 experience when I was a kid, of the bottom falling out from under my nice middle class existence, and realizing that that was a thing that could happen. And I think that shaped me a lot more than I thought at the time, because when I think about this now, and I get like really angry when, like, viscerally mad when politicians say that, like, why are people angry right now? Why are people upset? What do you mean you need $15 an hour minimum wage? And I'm just like, have you ever known what it was like to have the bottom fall out from under your life? And so yeah. So that was a little more personal answer than I normally give, but thank you. Anybody else?
You mentioned something about the militarization of the police.
Yeah.
And I haven't done any recent research, but I remember a number of years ago coming across some very specific information that police departments across the United States were being, there was like this new kind of focus that they were being developed as a paramilitary force to be used against we the people.
Yeah.
What have you found in your research so far? To what extent are you seeing this, like when you say militarization of the police, what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, you know, when we talk about the militarization of the police, we're talking about like the shifting of military equipment and training and really that kind of thing. So like the 1033 program is what everybody points to, which redirects. And a lot of this stuff is, and I get into this sort of deeply in the book because I'm obsessed with the Cold War and how we responded to it domestically. But one of the things that happened at the so-called end of the Cold War, or as Jeremy Scahill would say, at the shift to the Cold War on terror that we kind of have now, was that, you know, we didn't need these weapons anymore, so we were going to figure out where to use them, because all the companies that make them really like their profits, and that's one of the few things that we make in the USA, right? When you see the tear gas canisters from all over the world. Right, you remember the tear gas canisters in Egypt, and they were holding them up with the Made in the USA thing on them? And so, you know, I talk about that, but also it's like a hard story to tell, because, like, you know, and demilitarizing the police isn't going to stop everything. Like, Eric Garner wasn't even killed with a gun; he was killed with a chokehold. So, and you know, and as far as like using the police against the people, that's always been also the story. It's just always been which people. It's always a question of which people, and like the Occupy experience was like people who usually didn't have that experience having it. But you know, the police were used against labor organizers. Labor Day exists because the government cracked down on labor organizers and killed a bunch of people, and then said, "Oh my goodness, some of those people vote. We got to do something about this."
So they gave us a day off.
Exactly, and now we barbecue. Not knocking the barbecue. I'm a big fan of barbecue and days off, but labor likes to talk about like we fought and died for your rights to a 40-hour work week or something, but like they don't really talk about who did the killing very much. And so I think that's these are important things to recognize when thinking about the police.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you.
The gentleman back there. Good. Need your hand up before.
Yeah, thank you. So people talk about this thing called intersectionality, and can you kind of tell us what that is, or what you heard that is, and are there other examples in your book, I'm guessing, about intersectionality?
Yeah, so the term intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a black feminist law professor. And she was particularly theorizing this around how people experienced, how black women experienced sexual harassment, basically, in the workplace. And this was, they experienced racialized sexual harassment. You couldn't separate being a woman from being black, that these were things that intersect. And when we're talking about it, it's based on old organizing lessons of, again, mostly black organizers, mostly black women organizers who, have the experience of being a worker and woman and black all at once. And those aren't identities you can separate. When people talk about like the white working class, it's like this attempt to sort of say that these are the working class and these people over here, they have different interests and different needs. And so when we're talking about intersectional movements now, I'm talking about the understanding that like you don't have just interests as I don't have just interests as a woman that are separate from my interests as a person, a member of the working class, right? That like if I get pregnant and I need to have an abortion, it's because I can't afford to have a child because there's no functional childcare in this country and I don't make that much money. And so the fact that these are all overlapping identities that you can't really separate and pull apart, and that the people who are hit by multiple of them are, if you center their experiences and you understand that you have to fix all of these things at once, then the world gets better for everyone, which is why I keep citing the Vision for Black Lives document, because I think that that's a really good example of both intersectional analysis and thinking, and also of what happens when you put people who are affected by multiple oppressions in the center and listen to what they want. Yeah.
So he's talked a lot about the organizing in Wisconsin,
yeah,
and in a very positive way, even though there was a failure.
Yeah.
And I was really active in that labor union up to 2007 before I graduated and moved down here.
Yeah.
So to me, the story of Wisconsin is this horrible heartbreak because we were, we worked really hard for a long time.
And it's rough in Wisconsin still.
Yeah,
it's,
so I have lots of friends who are in other labor unions, not graduate student unions.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm interested in how can we tell the story differently, that it isn't just one of failure, because it feels like failure.
Yeah.
But it seems like what you're trying to tell in this book is that this is a story of a longer movement, and it was a kind of success, or it was a kind of spur to other action.
Yeah, I think that it's hard, right? Because there's sort of two tendencies that we have, which is one is to be like, oh my God, we're always losing, we never win anything, and everything is terrible because like we haven't won everything all at once. And the other one is to just sort of gloss it all over and be like, everything is wonderful, and like, I think it's really important to sort of be honest about the factors that contribute to wins and losses, and so, I make sure to mention that like Andrew Cuomo flipped in part because he was being investigated for corruption and not just because workers went on strike, although workers going on strike was really important. It was also that, he was looking for friends and he found some. Talking about Wisconsin is, it's hard. Scott Walker's still in charge. At least he's not going to be president, but like that's not really that much of an, Donald Trump. So, but and it's really, things are not good in Wisconsin, And things are certainly not good if you were once unionized and now not, or if you were at the university system, or any of those things. And so, you know, it is hard. It is a question of like what happened and what went wrong. And one of the people that I tell the story through in my book is somebody who has really just dropped out of movement work since then. And I thought it was important to include her story because, and she was in the TAA. And I thought it was important to include that story because it does, like, this is hard and like losing sucks. And this is like, and it's, you know, and it doesn't just suck because like you're emotionally invested in it like that too, but like it sucks because like your people's lives got worse. And yeah, and like there's not an easy answer to that, but it's also part of the reason that I wanted to tell this as an arc of a period in history and not as just like one story of one fight or one story of one election, was to say that like this thing like that we learn from losing and we learn from what went right too. So like the occupations that have happened all around the country since then, Occupy Wall Street, all these other things, they all kind of look like what happened in the Wisconsin Capitol. We sort of, you know, these moments of reclaiming public space and figuring out how to be political in public together, that I think that we first saw that really in Wisconsin, and it has been really important. It's not been uncomplicated. Turns out that when you have an atomized, depoliticized society, being political and public together is really hard, and it takes a lot of work. And but I do think that like, yeah, these are questions that I wrestled with while writing the book too. Is like how positive, how negative, how sort of. I mean, also didn't have that much space, so it was also a question of like, what can I fit in here in terms of critiques and what is, you know, what is for somebody else's book, kind of, which is a really hard thing to do because I want to write about everything. But I do think that, you know, putting these things in context is important to see what role that actually had. Yeah.
Kind of following on that, I noticed when you're talking, one of a refrain you said a few times as you talked about different places was the story was that they lost.
Yeah.
The story was that they lost, and like that's even how I talked about Moral Mondays in North Carolina for the longest time. It's like they've been doing all this organizing, they haven't actually won anything.
Yeah. Won a court case this year.
They did. They won a court case this year.
That's a big deal.
Right.
Because it was kind of the first thing.
But connected to your trip out to North Dakota
Yeah.
and the phrase you used, that the way they're decolonizing. I'm curious if you were to, and maybe you haven't processed this yet, but if you were to have that chapter in your book, how would that idea of decolonizing maybe influence the way, following on what you just talked about?
Yeah, and it was a thing that showed up in, you know, even during Occupy, right? There were people who were in different occupations who were like, we shouldn't use the word Occupy, like we're actually decolonizing the space. And that's a, you know, it's a very particular word to use when we're talking about, you know, American Indians. When we're talking about people who were literally colonized in this country, it's a very particular word to use. But it's also, I think it is a really, it's a powerful word to use, and it's a powerful thing to say that, like, actually we have the right to this space, and they are taking it away from us. Whether we talk about that in terms of like enclosure of the commons or any number of wonky ways we can talk about it, like that, that is that space. And like the Black Lives Matter action that's been going on in Los Angeles, outside of Los Angeles City Hall, to get rid of the police chief, they called it Decolonize LA City Hall, right? They did not say it was they said we're not an occupation, this is our space, and we're holding it. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a thing we have to reckon with in this country in particular, is that particular history, which is why I like talking about it while standing in front of James Connolly. It's an important part of his struggle. The gentleman in the baseball cap.
What role do you, or to what extent, if any, do you think that like police unions have in some of these situations?
The FOP just endorsed Donald Trump.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or like the Border Patrol Union, they did something similar, and there are groups that want to expel them from AFL-CIO, and others that will say stuff like, well, if those employees aren't unionized, then, they'll cite all the reasons why people shouldn't believe in unions. So it's, how do they fit in?
Yeah, I think I really, I like when the critiques of police unions are sort of coming from inside the House, or coming from inside the House of Labor in this case, because otherwise it does tend to fall into these kind of union-busting tropes of like, well, most workers should have unions, but not those workers, which is also what people say about teachers. Because, the FOP, which is not part of the AFL-CIO, just endorsed Trump. The Border Guards Union endorsed Trump a long time ago. Yeah. That's not surprising. And those are, the FOP is already its own thing. And actually, I didn't write about this in the book, but one of the interesting things was talking about Wisconsin is, we talked about Ohio, which I talked about a little bit in the book too, because Ohio, they overturned the anti-union law. But also in Ohio, they included the cops. Scott Walker carved out the cops. And the firefighters, although the firefighters, threw down in Wisconsin because the firefighters understood the concept of solidarity and the police did not so much. But in Ohio, because the police and the firefighters were included, the FOP was actually part of this coalition to overturn this thing, which it normally didn't do. And I actually, when I was out there with the bus full of students, interviewed the local FOP head there to talk about that particular thing, because it was so rare that police unions acted like they were part of the labor movement in any case. But even in places where the police don't have unions, the police are still the police, and I think ultimately the problem with the police is a structure that it's not that they have unions, it's that they are police, and that the institution of police, that the institution of police is fundamentally inimical to the cause of freedom. But I think the labor movement should remember, again, who is doing the killing and which side they're on. But the labor movement also needs to remember that when we're talking about North Dakota, too, because there was a lovely statement out there today about how the people who are protesting should get out of the way because good jobs or something. So the labor movement has some things it needs to work on, but I think that it also needs to think about, one of those things needs to be its relationship to police and policing. So.
You were talking about a little while ago about how these movements go in waves, and what I would be curious about, based on the research that you've done, is are people getting any better at organizing and sustaining movements? So are we getting any more powerful in these movements? Have you seen that there's a more sustainable energy, or that things are starting to coalesce together with more strength than they used to? Because it feels like we're at a critical time in this country, and that we really need that kind of energy to be sustained, rather than, oh, I'm passionate about this for 5 minutes and now I'm done with it.
Yeah, and I think that it's been really interesting to watch the movement for Black Lives groups that have developed, and the different organizations that are experimenting with different structures and are also hitting speed bumps in various ways, but are really thinking about what is a structure that can sustain us, and that's and these are groups that have been going on were founded, many of them after George Zimmerman's acquittal, or after Trayvon Martin's killing, and so these are groups that are now going on 3, almost 4 years in some cases, that are working on and experimenting with, and in some cases doing well with, in some cases sort of throwing them out and starting again, different structures to try to be sustainable. But they have we are looking at groups that are lasting a few years at least. So it's hard to. I'll write another book in 20 years and see. Okay. But I do think that there is learning going on, certainly. John?
Yeah. In a sense, everything you're talking about takes place with the background of the 20th century, in which there were, in a way, occupations of Russia, China, Cuba, the anti-imperialist struggles in India, the Africa, which most of them have been defeated with the exception of Cuba, in my opinion. How do you think that framework fits with what's going on now? I mean, the activists you're talking about are young. They didn't.
And so, you know, those were the struggles that really shaped people in a way that, like, I think is still, we're still seeing that being passed down. And we are seeing that, like, you know, there are delegations going to Palestine. These are struggles that people are connecting with, anti-imperial struggles, anti-colonial struggles around the world still. But yeah, it's a struggle, I think, always to keep up that memory of, like, what the last generation of people were fighting. And we don't do a really good job of it in this country. We certainly don't teach it in public schools, you know. They don't teach recent history in public schools at all. But, yeah, so I think that's a thing that, like, and in the downtimes, to sort of link this to the last question, that, like, we can't always see what's going on because it's not always in the news, or we're not always invited to those particular organizing meetings. But people are also reading and thinking and learning and trying to figure out what is, you know, what's next, but also what's already happened, so that they can, you know, not reinvent the wheel. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but it's I had everything. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
So let me see if I can phrase this question. I guess I'm wondering how you found the people who have been involved in these very intense movements, like Occupy or Black Lives Matter, you know, ongoing demonstrations. You know, it seems like those are peak moments in people's lives. There's just all this solidarity. There's another way of being with people.
Yeah.
And that changes people, that people remember that, it resonates. But, I mean, how much are you seeing just despair that the win was not made, like in Wisconsin, and how much are you seeing that it changes people forever?
I mean, I think it both changes people forever, and they go through periods of despair.
Sure, sure. But
you know,
like,
yeah.
It seems like that's really the like what happened.
Yeah.
More than any, you know, like someone was elected. It seems so much more important that a lot of people were transformed in a very intense way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing people waking up. We're seeing people thinking about, again, these long-term questions, and thinking about this as a long-term struggle and not as something that's over, you know. Like, I always find it really funny, the people who are like, well, why didn't Occupy win? And I'm like, well, what do you think winning meant? And it's like, well, did you think they were going to overthrow capitalism in, like, you know, three months in Zuccotti Park? Like, no, come on. You know, these are long-term struggles, and sometimes people need to step back from them. That said, like, we live in a country and a society that doesn't do a very good job of taking care of people, and it's really hard to keep up the struggle. And somebody asked me about this at the last event that I did, and I should talk about it again. There was a young man named Marshall McCarroll who was from Ohio, who was an organizer, and he committed suicide not that long ago. And, you know, I think it's important to think about those things too, right? That this is a really, really hard struggle. You know, when I look at Ferguson, the crowds have gone and the press is gone, and what's happening now is that a lot of people are facing really trumped up, really potentially devastating sentences. You know, people are going to court, the dates are scattered so that you don't get a lot of momentum, so that you don't get all the reporters coming down. And these things are real, and we need to, you know, one of the things that we need to do as people who care about this is figure out how to support the people who are struggling in whatever way that they're struggling to be able to be part of the movement. I had this gentleman here, there, and Michelle. Yeah.
One of the things that we're starting to see is cross-fertilization of ideas among different movements. We see the broader agenda and the movement for Black Lives, and in the climate movement, we're seeing people recognize what Nancy Klein said about to change everything, we need everybody, and putting the frontline communities at the front of the line of march. apostolic lives and so forth. How do you see positive possibilities going forward in these various movements?
Yeah. I mean, the climate one, that was sort of why it ended up at the end of the book, because it was the people who are struggling with all of the other things written in this book are also the people who are on the front line, literally on the front lines of climate change. And that's, whether we're talking about the people in North Dakota or talking about the people in the South Bronx. One of my favorite people to quote from this book, I've quoted him a million times already, and I'm going to keep doing it because he's great, is Michael Johnson from South Bronx Unite. And I first talked to him in 2011, 2012. They were, and still are, fighting a campaign against Fresh Direct, which the grocery delivery service, which is not so fresh and direct when you've got 100 diesel trucks coming through your neighborhood every day. When you already live in a neighborhood that has toxic waste dumps and garbage facilities and no green space and all of this stuff. And, he says, they rewind a little bit. So Eric Garner, who was killed by a police officer, in a chokehold, and I made reference to this earlier about the militarization of the police, but also, Eric Garner had asthma. And Eric Garner had asthma because he grew up in a Superfund site. He grew up near the Gowanus Canal. And so, he was already, he couldn't breathe because, we locate pollution in places where the people we have deemed expendable are. And those are the same people that will be deemed expendable when they are killed by a police officer. And so, South Bronx Unite, where they said, we can't breathe, was their slogan, because it's the same, is fast or slow. And so, I think often, we mistake, putting these people at the front of the line, they're at the front of the line, we just kind of have to sometimes get out of the way. I was talking to one of the women that I interviewed in Standing Rock, and she was like, we don't need white people to constantly be apologizing for colonization. We just kind of need them to stand with us, and sometimes they have to stand behind us, because they are doing the work, and they are organizing, and they are leading, and both the media and sort of the institutionalized quote unquote progressive movement don't always look. So, yeah, I have a couple back here, this gentleman.
Yeah, we've heard a lot tonight about how the Occupy Wall Street people they lost. I don't think they lost.
I don't think they lost either.
They lost. They won the idea, or they put forth the idea that the 1% is waging total war against us.
Mm-hmm.
They created a new notion of class solidarity among the American people.
Yep.
Led to the fight for 15, and led to the helped, I think, brought in the Sanders campaign. I think that they did win. I think they did a lot of real good things. To say that they lost, I'm not saying that you did say it, but that's the perception out there that they lost. I think it's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just making the case for my book. Thank you. I don't really have anything to say to that other than you're 100% correct. Yeah. Yep.
Hi. Yes. I think Occupy. You have to set what your goals are. You have this goal
that was
you need something
one
you
of the
can
problems.
achieve, and pointing out income inequality. But however, I remember Barney Frank said, "Where are these people in 2010 when we elected all these crazy Republicans they're complaining about now?" And now Scott Walker, as long as you have the low turnout, he gets reelected every 4 years. There are going to be problems. Ferguson, the American turnout was extremely low. The city was run by white people. And believe me, when you've got everything run by white people,
you do know why the South had historically low black voter turnout, right?
It's
not just because people decided to stay home.
Most inner cities across the country, we have low African American turnout. We have
Ferguson's a suburb.
Off-year elections, we have low across and the Tea Party old white people, they show up and vote for dog catcher.
Yep.
And they take over school boards.
Yep.
And they put people, they've got Jesus riding dinosaurs, and everybody's got to run out and vote for the school board to get rid of these people. And if people showed up and voted in these little elections instead of, having, I love demonstrations. I went to Occupy, I brought pizzas and stuff. It was great. I really enjoy it. But I'm sorry, the mundane fact of, just off-year elections, the Tea Party proved the difference you can make. They took over vast amounts of the government by showing up and voting.
Showing up and running too.
And recommend this in these left-wing meetings, but it's just you ever think, just think about it.
Yeah, no, but I mean, people have to run for office too, though. And if you are told to go out and vote and nobody on the ballot represents your interests,
if you don't show up to vote, there's not going to be anybody. Like if Russ Feingold, when he gets voted out of office, well, he's running again, I know, but you start thinking, well, why should I run on that platform if no one's going to show up and vote because I'm in an off year and I'm going to get voted out? You see what I mean? So it's kind of a chicken.
So I get, but I mean, you have to give people somebody to vote for.
Exactly, and like I say, but if you show up and vote, but they know you're going to show up and vote, then they're going to, I'll run then because I know these people are going to back me. But the left always comes around with all the revolutions coming. I don't need to vote. I've been hearing that all my life.
I didn't say that.
What?
I didn't say that.
No, I didn't say you did.
Okay.
I did not say you did.
Okay.
I said I've heard that all my life.
Okay.
I really just, and I'm definitely tired of them getting old. You know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sean?
Yeah. I mean, you talked about the movement of Black Lives and labor movement in Wisconsin and movement for climate justice. I feel like sort of historically one of the other parts of this mosaic of movements is the anti-war movement. And aside from BDS and since really since the Iraq War has started, we just seem to be wholly lacking that here in the U.S. at least. Meanwhile, Iraq and Afghanistan are just like it's which one ends first? The next one's still going to be the longest war, in American history, and then you have Syria and
the Cold War on Terror.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yes, exactly. Cold War on Terror. So, what have you seen in terms of the sort of an engendering of a contemporary anti-war movement?
It's interesting, right? Because like one of the other things that I didn't write about in this book was the big marches against the Iraq War, right? Because there were massive marches around the world against the Iraq War, and they did absolutely nothing. The Bush administration just went right on ahead and did exactly what they were going to do already, because that's what they do. And I think that we, and I say we as like the broad sort of everybody who thought that maybe going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan was a bad idea, everything got so focused on getting rid of Bush. And I remember, and I went to the inauguration in 2008, and I sort of went going like, I know it's going to be my job to be like on this guy's, case for the next 8 years, and so this is like the last possible moment to feel like this is going to be good. But like I remember watching Bush's helicopter fly away, and there was this whole feeling that like now things are going to get better, even though I'm, at heart a cynical jerk and also a journalist, so that's, I know better. But yeah, and then like that energy completely shifted, and I think part of the reason the energy completely shifted is the financial crisis became, and the sort of repercussions of that became a much more immediate concern for a lot of people. But I also talked to people who are in the book who were radicalized, and were radicalized around class by their experience of friends and family members being in the army and being in Iraq or Afghanistan. And understanding that this was, the people who go to fight these wars are the working class, and the people who start these wars are the ones who are on the board of Halliburton. Haven't heard that name in a while, huh? And so...
Gotta read Colin's emails.
Yeah, I was in North Dakota. I missed everything. I gotta read I'd rather read James Connolly. So... Yeah, and I think, when we're talking about, and I wanted to talk about the militarization question, not just to sort of overemphasize the militarization of the police, but the way that, like, we've sort of accepted the new normal, right? The new normal is we're going to have drones go in and whatever, and the new normal is, like, Hillary Clinton's probably going to escalate in Syria. And that's, like, our choices that are worse, and if that's what we're given, and that's what we're supposed to just kind of accept. And it sucks. I watch people, not to talk about this election too much, but like watch people sort of yada, yada, yada war when people are like, but Hillary Clinton has this track record of, war and wanting war and being the one pressuring the Obama administration to go harder on things. And people were like, but Donald Trump! But woman president, which don't get me started. But yeah, it is a moment where we saw the shift, and the focus was like was so heavily on the war from 2001 to 2008, and then it's been drifted away from that, and partly financial crisis, partly Obama. So everything's better now, right? Not so much.
I really like this kind of point you make of when the labor movement gets Labor Day, but there's kind of forgetting of who's doing the killing.
Yeah.
But when you kind of compare it to these cycles of some victories for the left, and then you forget. It seems on some level that it's not just that people forget, but that parts of the left become instrumental in the reconstruction of capitalism.
Yeah.
And so,
Absolutely.
Are you especially with like climate change? I know,
right.
this changes everything. It's sort of like it's cool because the world will end anyway, and so we have to deal with this problem. But I put to you like as a serious, somewhat my thought, cynical question. Yeah. Does the left, as you see it today, have the capacity to stop rebuilding the thing it keeps destroying? Does it have an identity? If not, building the system back so you have somebody to tell, I told you so too.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of parts of that question, right? That's a really, I think they're, like, let's be totally real. I think that when a lot of these movements started happening, in every wave of it, there are people who consider themselves as the left who kind of just sit back and say, like, well, you're not doing it right, so I'm not joining. I'm going to go back to Connolly and De Leon, right? There's always the people who are like, you're doing the struggle wrong, I'm going to sit on my butt and wait for the revolution to happen, which is never going to happen, but it makes me feel good to say that I know how to revolution better than you. And that's a thing that, like, we ultimately want to put ourselves out of business, or we should. Like, somebody asked me today what I would do if we all win, and I'm like, I want to go write a novel. I don't want to be writing about politics. And then when we're talking about the left and the institutions of the left rebuilding the thing that we're opposed to, we were just talking about police and unions and the labor movement, saying, not the entire labor movement, CWA and NNU sent statements of solidarity to Standing Rock, but like, the AFL-CIO put out a statement today signed by President Richard Trumka saying that, the pipeline jobs are good jobs and we need good jobs. And I'm like, as people say, there are no jobs on a dead planet. But yeah, and it's on some level the importance of understanding intersectional movements, right? To say that, like, you might get a few jobs for some Teamsters and some laborers and some operating engineers out of this pipeline, but you're going to destroy somebody else's land and potentially the water for 16 million people or something, right? I don't remember the exact number there. And that's, not what solidarity looks like, especially because some of those workers who are supposedly local people getting family-sustaining jobs are going to be giving their family water from that river that potentially has oil in it. We can't sort of break off and make a deal that sells out the rest of the people because it will be a good short-term deal for us. Like, I'm on Connolly's side on the raising wages struggle, but I also, you have to understand that, like, you can't do that at the expense of the big struggle and the long-term struggle and the struggle to have a livable planet in 100 years. That'd be nice. But yeah, it's a real criticism of the left and labor movement. Yeah.
Just quickly on the pipelines issue, I've been saying for a while, we have this immense need to rebuild all the water infrastructure. Flint, Hoosick Falls.
I'm in Newburgh.
Yeah, and all the pipeline workers to be gainfully employed at the same wages. We build in the water infrastructure.
This is an excellent idea. You should write a white paper.
We need to work through the environmental justice movement with the labor movement to get them to get that.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to mention, I think Joe has more information than I do. There's some caravans going to Standing Rock. I think departing Monday. I think people are collecting stuff at the co-op.
Yeah, 3 to 5 tomorrow.
Excellent.
You can bring donations, and I have a specific list if you're interested.
Excellent. Yeah. And if you get a chance, you should really go. It's a really incredible experience. Although it's getting cold. It's pretty cold tonight.
Still worth it.
Still worth it.
I'll totally write.
Can we buy some books, maybe? Is that
Yep,
possible?
absolutely.
All right.
I think we can be done.
Thank you so much.